This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and today is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In most episodes of this series, I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the top 10 cards that make damage unpreventable. Before we get into that though, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Aura. While the cards in this video look at unpreventable damage in Magic, Aura is an app that is all about preventing damage to your privacy. As you probably know, if you do a Google search for yourself, you're likely to find that the internet knows a whole lot more about you than you would like. Aura can find and identify the data brokers out there who have made this information publicly available, and it can even make it so you stop receiving junk mail and robocalls. In addition to that, Aura also features a VPN, a password manager, a real-time credit monitor, and more. You can use my link aura.com/magic to try the app for a free 2-week trial and put an end to the damage being done to your privacy, while also supporting the channel. You can find the link in the description, or you can scan the QR code that's on the screen right now. Alright, let's get back to the video. The idea to do a top 10 on unpreventable damage came to me while I was doing research for an updated top 10 burn spells list, which will be showing up next month at some point. As I was doing the research, I realized that there are many good cards out there that deal damage that is unpreventable or make damage unpreventable, and I figured that deserved a list of its own. I already did a top 10 on damage prevention, so it definitely makes sense to look at the flip side of that, which is unpreventable damage. There are lots of ways to prevent damage in Magic, including mechanics like protection and shield counters, and lots of individual card effects like Fogs and Burrenton Forge Tender. Preventing damage is a pretty common way to counter aggressive red and burn decks, since they tend to go all in on using their cards and other resources to do damage as quickly as possible, and if you can find a way to prevent that damage, a red deck ends up going down a card for nothing, and stopping even one of their cards from doing damage is often enough to turn the tide and make them run out of gas. But as we'll see in this video, red is given lots of ways to deal unpreventable damage. To be eligible for this list, a card had to deal unpreventable damage or make damage unpreventable. I think you'll be surprised by how stacked this list is. I certainly was. There are only 25 cards eligible for it, but 16 of them have at least one top 8 at a major event, and the top 5 cards on this list all have 45 points or more. I certainly didn't think that 64% of the cards that involve unpreventable damage would have made an impact on competitive Magic, but they have. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, it is Insult to Injury. This is a split card from Amonkhet that has the Aftermath mechanic. For this particular type of split card, you can only cast the top part, in this case Insult, from your hand, and you can only cast the bottom part, in this case Injury, from your graveyard. The Insult half of the card is a 3-mana sorcery that makes damage unpreventable for an entire turn, while also doubling the amount of damage your stuff does for the remainder of the turn. Injury is a 3-mana sorcery that does 2 damage to a creature and 2 damage to a player or planeswalker. While each side of this can be individually pretty nice, things get especially spicy when you have the full 6 mana to cast both halves in a single turn, as Injury will do double damage too. Insult to Injury was played in mono red and Rakdos aggro decks while it was in standard. At number 9, it is Bane Fire. This X spell does X damage to any target, and it exiles creatures that die after being dealt damage this way. It also comes with Hellbent, which means the card has a bonus effect if your hand is empty, and in this case, Bane Fire can't be countered and its damage can't be prevented. It gained most of its points in Ravnica Block Constructed, but it was also featured in a Jeskai Control deck in Standard, and a Dragon Stompy deck in Legacy. At number 8, it is Flaring Pain. This 2-mana instant comes with flashback for 1 red mana, and its effect is pretty simple. It makes it so damage can't be prevented for the remainder of the turn. Most cards that make damage unpreventable also do something else, as we've already seen, but not Flaring Pain. However, the fact it can shut off all damage prevention over 2 separate turns is a big deal in the right deck. It saw some play in Standard in the early 2000s, but has done a lot more work in Pauper, where it shows up in the sideboard of a wide variety of decks, ranging from Bogles to Burn to mono-red aggro. Fogs are pretty common in the format, and Flaring Pain is a fairly obligatory sideboard card to combat decks that are capable of blanking your damage for an entire turn. It is likely to keep gaining points in Pauper going forward, and it's a great candidate to continue to move up the list. At number 7, it is Urzas Rage. This 3-mana instant does 3 damage to any target, and it can't be countered by spells or abilities. On top of that, if you kick it by paying an additional 9 mana, it gets upgraded to 10 damage, and the damage it deals can't be prevented. Kicking it involves a lot of mana, so it's nice knowing that when you pay that massive cost, there isn't a whole lot that can stop this from doing its damage, between the fact that it can't be countered and its damage can't be prevented. It saw play in aggro decks and control decks alike when it was in block, standard, and extended, but it hasn't gained any points since 2002. At number 6, it is Bane Fire. Similar to Demon Fire, this is an X-Burn spell that does unpreventable damage when a certain condition is fulfilled. In this case, the condition is much easier, since Bane Fire becomes unpreventable and uncounterable when you pay 5 or more for X. It's gained most of its points in Standard, and it's benefited from 2 separate runs through the format, one from its original printing in Conflux, and another from a Core Set 2019 reprint. Both times, it showed up in the main deck and sideboards of red decks of all varieties, including Control, Midrange, and Aggro. More recently, it's found success in Pioneer, where it's a win condition in some Lotus Field ramp decks, which seek to produce a ton of mana for a lethal, uncounterable, unpreventable Bane Fire, and it's also played in Legacy, where it's appeared in mono-red Storm decks that can produce a lot of mana. It's a great win condition because you know your opponent just can't interact with it in any way. It looks likely it's going to gain more points in the future. At number 5, it is Combust. This uncounterable instant does 5 damage for only 2 mana, and the damage can't be prevented. However, it can only be used to target white or blue creatures. In Standard, Combust didn't actually see much play, only receiving 8 points in the format, and this is despite the fact that it was printed in both Magic 2011 and Magic 2012. There just weren't enough decks around that it was good against in those Standard formats. However, it was a key sideboard card in Modern for that format's first few years of existence. It could disrupt the Splinter Twin combo really effectively, since the targets for Splinter Twin were always blue creatures, and it was also pretty nice against Delver decks. Splinter Twin eventually got banned in Modern, and Delver hasn't been relevant there in a while, and as a result, Combust isn't really useful in the format anymore either, and it hasn't gained any points there since 2015. At number 4, it is Skullcrack. This is a 2-mana instant that does 3 damage to a player, shuts off life gain for a turn, and makes it so damage can't be prevented for a turn. Skullcrack is great in burn and aggro decks when you know your opponent's going to be trying to shut you down with damage prevention or life gain. Doing damage while also shutting those things down at the same time is pretty great and can often determine the outcome of a game. Unsurprisingly, it's been played in red aggro decks in Standard and Pioneer, appearing in both the main deck and the sideboard. It's been the most prolific in Modern though, and that makes sense, because that's a format that has had a relevant burn deck in it ever since day one back in 2011. Skullcrack is likely to keep gaining points going forward, but that's also true for all the cards in front of it. At number 3, it is Questing Beast, the only non-red card on this list. Questing Beast has a famously loaded text box, and alongside its Vigilance, Death Touch, Haste, and the fact it can't be blocked by creatures with 2 or less power, and the fact you can damage a Planeswalker when it does combat damage to an opponent, you'll also find that it has a static effect that makes it so combat damage dealt by creatures can't be prevented. The Beast definitely gives you a ton for your investment. If you're up against it, you can't just sit back and let it hit you and try to race, because Vigilance means it will still be able to block. Because it has haste, it can often attack the turn it comes down really effectively, and Death Touch means that if you want to kill it, you're probably going to have to use a card or 2. Questing Beast has been played in multiple formats, and that's going to continue. At number 2, it is Wild Slash. This 1-mana instant can do 2 damage to any target, and if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, damage can't be prevented during the turn you cast it. In other words, this is shock with upside, so It's no surprise that it saw a lot of play in Standard, as most Shock variants do. Wild Slash has also found its way into red aggro decks in Pioneer, and has even gained a few points in modern Prowess decks. It's going to keep gaining points in the future. And at number 1, it's Bone Crusher Giant, which gets here as a result of its adventure, which is called Stomp. It costs 1 generic and a red to do 2 damage to any target, while also shutting down damage prevention for the entire turn. The Giant is amazingly efficient, because after you cast Stomp, you can also cast it as a 3-mana 4/3 that punishes the opponent for targeting it with something. In other words, the Giant really does what it can to make sure your opponent takes damage no matter what. Bone Crusher Giant was so ubiquitous in the Standard he was part of that many creatures who might be otherwise playable in other formats just couldn't be played, since if you had an X2 in your deck that didn't add something permanent to the board, it was pretty miserable to get it easily killed by the Giant's adventure, which really only cost the opposing player half a card, and that just wasn't an advantage you could give up. It was able to see play both in straight-up aggressive red decks and in more adventure-centric decks as well. While it isn't quite as format-defining in other formats as it was in Standard, it also sees play in Historic, Pioneer, Legacy, Modern, and even Vintage. As a result of all of that consistent multi-format success, it's hard to imagine that Bone Crusher Giant will ever lose its position at the top of this list. So, those are the 10 unpreventable damage cards that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you're tired of your damage being prevented, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card in the video. If you want to catch future MTG Top 10s and other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, and there's over 550 of them, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a patron or by becoming a channel member. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.